Well, welcome to the SecurityDNA podcast produced by SecurityInfoWatch.com. I'm John Doberstein, managing editor of SecurityInfoWatch and the producer of this podcast. The editors here at Security InfoWatch utilize this podcast to provide detailed, actionable information of value to security professionals. This includes industry news, trends and analysis, technology solutions, policy risk analysis, and management. Today I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Steve Lasky, for this episode. As the editorial director for the Security Group at Endeavor Business Media, Steve brings a unique perspective to our discussions. His wealth of knowledge and experience in the security industry make him an invaluable contributor to our podcast. Today, he will engage in a fascinating conversation with our guest, former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff. Mr. Chertoff is co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, a global security risk management and growth advisory firm. He co-founded the firm after a notable career in public service where he repeatedly addressed security issues of first impression. As Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009, Mr. Chertoff led the largest reorganization of the federal civilian workforce since World War II. He gave up his lifetime federal appeals court judgeship to serve as Department of Homeland Security Secretary. Earlier, at the U.S. Department of Justice, he supervised the investigation into the 9/11 attacks. Secretary Chertoff began his career as a federal prosecutor in New York in 1983, where he led the simultaneous prosecution of the heads of 5 major mafia crime families. At Chertoff Group, Secretary Chertoff applies the same critical thinking discipline he used in government to help major corporations address evolving security issues, including cyber, geopolitical, and physical risk. His work has significantly influenced CEOs' perceptions of risk management. And with that, let's turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. Well, Secretary Chertoff, I tell you, it's great to have you here on SecurityDNA. And we appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to be with us. You know, in February of 2005, you were appointed only the second Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, which at that time was still a fledgling government agency. So you began an aggressive reorg of the sprawling DHS agency, focusing on improving your screening of passengers boarding airplanes after the 9/11 event, the security of U.S. borders with Mexico and Canada, and the safety of urban mass transit. So this promulgation of Homeland Security regulations and spearheading a national cybersecurity strategy really was something that was unprecedented at the time. So in your position as DHS Secretary, attempting to balance the need for Homeland Security and that need for civil liberties would be a challenge for you, and I know that's something that concerns you. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of how you have viewed your job and your philosophy of securing the homeland, but still keeping those other things in skew?
Well, we obviously had a challenge in bringing together and getting unity of effort among a number of different agencies that had previously been housed in different departments, right. Or, for example, in the case of FEMA, had been an independent agency. And so you had turf struggles squared, because everybody felt like they were being moved and they weren't necessarily happy about it. Interestingly, the organization that in many ways was the best and the most helpful and whose DNA is really part of the department was the Coast Guard. Because the Coast Guard, as a military organization, was used to operating cooperatively with other agencies. And of course, it also bridged civilian and military roles, given some of what the Coast Guard does. So bringing everybody together and getting a unity of effort and suppressing the not invented here mentality, that was very important. But the other thing was setting reasonable expectations, which is that we manage risk, we don't eliminate it. If you think what you're getting is a department that means you'll never have a problem, you're deluding yourself. What you're doing, hopefully, is getting a department that will prioritize those areas of greatest consequence and threat, and will reduce those vulnerabilities, will build resilience for those instances where you can't stop something bad from happening, and is flexible enough to adapt as the threat landscape changes.
It's interesting you should say that, because, probably your biggest challenge at the at DHS when you started. It was a non-domestic or a foreign terrorist event. It was Katrina. So working with FEMA to overcome that event had to be an incredible challenge.
It was. And what we discovered was that the concept of operations for where the federal government plays a role in dealing with disaster response had a flaw. The flaw was it depended upon having a competent state and local government, and with the federal government then being a backstop. And that worked in many areas. I know, for example, when we were down in Florida for a hurricane, same time, and Florida worked very well. They had a very robust system of emergency management. They deployed the National Guard. We were able to help them with resources. The problem was that New Orleans was not prepared that way. And when we tried to surge, we realized that we didn't have the resources in place or the plans, and we had to build them on the fly. So the takeaway from Katrina was to sit down with all of our constituents and, first of all, analyze, do they have a plan for dealing with emergencies? If they do, is it properly resourced? And then to fit what we needed to do into that template. So to give you an example, after the Katrina debacle, we had a hurricane in 2007 in the same region, and it was much, much more effectively handled because we had built the capabilities and the resources and the plans and to be able to surge right away. And so we evacuated everybody, and there was no significant loss of life in 2007.
It's interesting to me that, before your appointment to the Bush cabinet, where you served from 2003 to 2005 on the U.S. Courts of Appeal in the Third Circuit, before becoming a federal judge, you were Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. In that position, as we talked about, you investigated 9/11, and you also formed and led the Enron Task Force, where you produced more than 20 convictions. Taking those experiences and also this FEMA experience with Katrina, where you had to deal with resiliency, risk management, business continuity, and preparedness. How did those experiences investigating, prosecuting terrorists, dealing with white-collar crime, kind of transition to what you're doing in the Chertoff Group and, deal with your mission statement that you've got now?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that what it does is, first of all, it teaches you to be strategic.
Okay.
To look at the end game, what is the goal, what are you trying to achieve, and not simply go through the motions of step by step, but understand what direction you're headed to and where the journey is taking you. It also teaches you decisiveness, because when you're conducting an investigation or a disaster response or even trying a case, you don't have a lot of time to go in the back room and cogitate. You've got to often make decisions based on, imperfect information quickly. Some of them will be wrong. Hopefully most of them will be right. But it teaches you how to go to grab the essence of a problem and figure out what tools you have at hand and then make decisions about how to deploy them in real time before the decision gets taken away because events pass beyond what you're able to address.
Yeah, how do you prepare when you're dealing with your clients, when you're dealing with CSOs and you're dealing with C-level risk and business continuity executives? How do you prepare them to think strategically? Because you can talk about thinking strategically, but it's not something everybody gets.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, part of what we do is, again, we do try to understand what are the things they're most concerned about.
Right.
And there are two elements to that. One is, what is the likelihood of something bad happening? And the other is, what is the kind of event that would be a major consequence, perhaps a business-threatening issue? And once you get those identified and you work with your counterpart in the company, they can begin to start to think about, what do I care about the most? What would I address first? If I have a limited amount of time, what should my priorities be? So it's a question of putting the strategy in concrete terms, given their understanding of the business necessities.
Let's talk a little bit about the world as we see it now in DHS. Considering what we're looking at global hotspots around the world today in Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza, the Iranian influence of the Houthis in the Red Sea, and the ever-present specter of China. What's your take right now on how DHS is rising to meet these evolving challenges of possible security and economic impacts on the U.S.? And, would you approach things any differently?
Well, of course, this involves more than DHS. I mean, this is an all-hands on deck set of issues involving DOD, the Department of Justice, DHS, and the White House. Because I think in my lifetime, I don't remember as many different kinds of serious challenges as we face now. We continue to face terrorism issues, as you see with the Houthis or, other things around the world. But now we're dealing with what looks to be almost a replay of part of the Cold War. We're dealing with tension with China. We've got Middle Eastern war. And all of these things are happening at once. And it really requires bringing all of the tools to the table to deal with. I do think the White House has been good at being strategic, working with Secretary Mayorkas and some of the other cabinet secretaries in identifying the gamut of issues that you have to deal with. And so, for example, some of the issues with industrial policy and supply chain protection were not being addressed previously, but now are being addressed. And that's important, even though it's going to take a little bit of time. So I do think that we're being strategic, but I also have to say there's not exactly total agreement in our government about how to proceed. I mean, you saw that, for example, with an issue about denying additional funding to Ukraine. Fortunately, we got by that issue. You saw it with the border proposal that a few weeks ago would have done a significant amount to help the administration control the border by adjudicating asylum seeking quickly. And oddly, that was voted down by people who claim they want to do more at the border. So, I mean, the politics gets in the way of the strategy, unfortunately, from time to time.
Yeah, and that, again, like you said, that is unfortunate. To put the cherry on top in July with all the issues going around the globe as far as challenges to security and risk, we're looking at an Olympics in Paris. Yeah. And, having been to Paris many times, it's an open city. They're taking a unique approach to the Olympics this year where they're going to be all open venues. Yeah. So how in the heck do you secure a city like Paris? And then because you've got all the neighboring countries and Paris, has some internal strife as well, how do you secure venues that are open like this?
Well, that's going to be very difficult. They're going to have to rely to a considerable extent on intelligence about who might be out there and what might be being planned. I'm an advisor to a group called the Transatlantic Circle of Trust, right, which was started a few years ago by senior, former, and current intelligence officials from the U.S., UK, and Europe, because they had seen failures of information sharing even among the allies. And that had led, for example, to the Bataclan shooting in Paris a few years back. So the idea was to build relationships and connections among the groups in order to make sure that they're more comfortable sharing information and can be responsive more quickly. So I do think intelligence sharing is going to be key. They're going to have to monitor who's traveling in, and they're going to have a plan to respond immediately if it turns out that somebody's about to commit an act of terrorism.
You think that the intelligence network is adept enough right now to meet those challenges?
I think it's gotten better, but it's a challenging issue because you're dealing not only with one set of potential terrorists, but we now have all kinds of groups from across the spectrum that might be motivated. Look what just happened to Prime Minister Fico in Slovakia. Right. And I don't think they've yet figured out what motivated the shooter, but you can get people who are just disturbed, deciding they want to attract attention.
You've stated in the past that risk management has become the CEO's concern and that you help your clients develop comprehensive strategies to manage risk without building barriers that hinder business operations. So what are the trends that you're seeing regarding the convergence of cyber risk, physical risk, and protecting personal, global, and supply chain assets across large enterprises?
I think there's a recognition, there has been for some time, that cyber risk is an increasing challenge and needs to be addressed. And I think what's become more of an issue lately is physical risk. Whether it be property crimes or even violent crimes, and that can be taking place overseas, it could take place in the U.S., and they do converge. Sometimes you have circumstances where a cyber attack is supplemented by a physical attack or vice versa. And then, of course, the supply chain becomes an issue because, as we learned during COVID, if you can't get your supplies, you can't be in business. So what I think has been challenging for boards and executives is mapping all of their vulnerabilities, not just within their own premises, but with respect to all the organizations that are feeding them with supplies or services, and then the distribution mechanism they use in order to deliver services to their customers. And I think it is resulting in more investment on the security side for major enterprises.
I mean, you see that today where security is no longer an afterthought. It's now looked at as an expense, but as a business risk and organizational tool. So that's a good thing. I mean, I've been in the business 30 years and I've seen it change a lot. So, right now we're in the early days of what we know is going to be a contentious election season. We've got an extremely polarized electorate, potential election interference from bad actors in Russia and China, the threat of advanced technologies increasing the pollution of misinformation, feeding media and the public. So I know you're a thought leader in AI, and that's a very concerning subject to you. So right now, what do you see as our major obstacles right now to keep the airways free of misinformation during this election season?
Well, that gets challenging because some people argue, there's a First Amendment right to, speak out even if you say things that are wrong. And that's true, but I think there's some limitations to that. One is, for example, when you have foreign actors engaged in artificial misinformation, that's not First Amendment protected right, particularly if they're hiding who they are, pretending to be somebody else. And to the extent, for example, AI allows deep fakes where it looks like somebody is saying something and it's really not them. Not clear to me that the ability to do that without disclosure is protected by the First Amendment. So I think we've got to work with the platforms in order to, first of all, identify when people are misrepresenting who they are. We may need to limit the algorithms which collect data about all of us and then use that to manipulate us by targeting us very specifically with particular items of data that are designed to appeal to us, even if they're false. And again, some of this may simply be disclosure, saying that this message comes to you because artificial intelligence has identified you as someone who wants to hear this. What you want to do is give warning to people so they understand they've got to get their antenna up because they may be being gamed. Right. And I think that is something which the First Amendment permits the platforms to do, and maybe even getting appropriate regulations with respect to that.
Right. Along that same track, what concerns you domestically right now as we head in further into the election season? Do you see any impacts from any ongoing social unrest or domestic threats? I know that the FBI has their antennas up. What concerns you?
I'm worried about all the efforts to interfere with the election process, and along with that, efforts to build in things that will discredit the process if someone doesn't like the result. And that could be artificial intelligence and misinformation. It could be threats of violence. There was a story in the newspaper today about local officials being threatened. And I'm concerned about election officials or election sites being potentially the target of violence. So we're going to need to raise our physical security for the infrastructure of voting, as well as our mental awareness of the fact that we may be gamed and manipulated. Now, we saw in 2020 that people were, by and large, the courts and the executive officials were very responsible in not letting themselves be manipulated. But now, of course, there's been 4 years for people to prepare and different kinds of tools to use.
And the tools have gotten better.
They've gotten more depth.
Yeah.
And I worry in particular because I think the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians really want to pour gasoline on this fire, because the Russians may well feel that depending on the outcome, they'll get a free hand in Ukraine. So what happens in our election is going to have a global ramification. And let me add, Steve, we're not the only fraught election coming up. We've got European elections coming up. There are elections in other parts of the world. And I think we're going to see the same actors playing a role all over the place.
Very true. Well, let's close it out with this. I know that, you have a long history in public service. And I'm just curious, making the transition over the last several years to your consulting group, what has been the most satisfying thing to you professionally moving into running this group, and some of the things you've accomplished and what you want to accomplish?
Well, the thing that's gratifying to me is I've been able to still work in an area that I think is important and where I feel I have a contribution to make. Because I'm in the private sector now, I have a little bit more flexibility. I can do some nonprofit work. I'm on the board of trustees of Freedom House, which works to promote freedom around the world. I've done other things in civil society. And I've had the opportunity to go overseas and meet with my counterparts in other parts of the world and see what they're dealing with. What it's allowed me to do is to continue to try to contribute in an area I care about, but with the flexibility to do it, based on where my interests are and frankly, based on where it's convenient. And so I've enjoyed doing that, and I've enjoyed working with colleagues who are also dedicated to doing the right thing to protect the country and its people.
Well, very good. I can't think of a better place to end our conversation today. And I would love to be in your inner circle anytime we can be of service to you as well. So, Secretary Chertoff, it's been a privilege to talk with you and share your knowledge and insights. And I want to thank you for taking time to visit with us and appreciate your contributions to not only our country, but to our security industry as well. So, again, I look forward to speaking with you down the road.
I do too, Steve. Thanks a lot and be well.
Thank you.
Well, Steve, I'd like to thank you and Secretary Chertoff for this fascinating discussion about his journey through government and into the executive risk sector. And I'm sure our audience has appreciated it as well. This is just a reminder to our audience that this podcast is for you. It's a way for you to stay informed about trends in the security industry anywhere, anytime. To access our podcast lineup, go to podbean.com and search for SecurityDNA. You can also find our podcasts in our Security Frontline, Integrator Newswire, and Security Insights e-newsletters. Of course, we'd love to get some feedback from you, our listeners, about topics they are interested in. If you have a suggestion, send an email to Steve Lasky, Slasky, at SecurityInfoWatch.com. This episode of the SecurityDNA podcast was recorded and produced by John Doberstein, Managing Editor of SecurityInfoWatch. For Steve Lasky, Secretary Chertoff, and everyone here at SecurityInfoWatch, thanks for listening and stay safe out there wherever you may be.